Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live a perfect life with that true love, without the ghosts of pain or betrayal haunting your door? That love you always imagined, that promises to be unbreakable until everything crumbles before your eyes. I'm Emily Davis. I'm 35 years old, and I want to share with you a piece of my life that, for a long time, I kept to myself. A piece of my story that, although marked by pain, is also a testament to faith, resilience, and healing. Trust me, what you're about to hear here isn't something you hear every day. As a Christian woman, I've always believed in God's love, His purpose for my life, and the power of prayer. I married, dreamed, planned, and sought happiness with someone who, I thought, shared those same ideals. But life has its own ways of teaching us, and no matter how much we try to protect ourselves, sometimes we're surprised by pain that knocks us off our feet. And that's what happened to me. The love I believed to be eternal turned into an illusion, and I found myself facing a cruel and devastating reality. Have you ever been in a situation where everything you believed you had built crumbles in an instant? What happens when you discover that the person you trusted most betrayed not only your trust, but also your heart? And worst of all, when you discover that, while you were praying for a miracle, they were building something very different. Do you recognize yourself in this experience? I know this topic may be uncomfortable, but believe me, the pain of betrayal, abandonment, and God's silence when He seems unresponsive can be transformed. The next event may change your perspective, because in the end, my story is about more than pain. It's about how faith, even when it seems shaken, can give us the strength to begin again. And that's exactly what I'm going to share with you today. I've always believed in love, the kind of love that goes beyond words, that's built over time, with trust and complicity. When I got married, my heart was full of dreams and expectations. I saw a bright future, with a house full of laughter, a close-knit family, and a marriage that would stand the test of time. We shared the same faith, the same hopes, and I truly believed that together we would overcome any obstacle. The promise of eternal love, which we spoke of in our vows, felt so real. I saw in him everything I'd ever imagined for my life. But life has a way of teaching us that things aren't always as they seem. What appeared to be perfection was actually just a facade, a carefully crafted illusion to hide something much deeper and more painful. I didn't know it, but I was about to discover that behind the smiles and promises lay something much darker, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle. He would pull away from me, as if the time we spent together wasn't enough anymore. Conversations diminished, hugs became rarer, and words of affection began to disappear. But even though my heart felt an uncomfortable sense of emptiness, I tried to do what any woman would do, seek explanations. Maybe I was being too demanding. Maybe I was asking for too much. We get used to making excuses, don't we? What seemed like a bad phase soon turned into something bigger, but I refused to believe it. Believe me, I looked for answers everywhere but where they truly were. I knew something was wrong, but how could I accept that the man I'd built a life with whom I'd shared dreams and prayers, could be cheating on me? I looked at him and asked, "How could you do this to me?" But with every unspoken word, every silence, I knew there was something there I hadn't yet seen. I didn't know it, but I was about to face the truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what came next changed everything for me. It wasn't just the pain of discovering a betrayal. It was the hidden truth behind it all, something I could never have imagined. A discovery that left me devastated and made me question everything I believed. It all started with small, almost imperceptible changes. Those details you initially choose to ignore because you don't want to believe something is wrong. The first thing I noticed was the emotional distance. It wasn't something I could put into words at first, but I knew something was growing apart between us. He no longer approached me like he used to. The looks we exchanged, once filled with affection and understanding, were now empty. I felt he was there, but at the same time, he wasn't. Physical contact diminished. Kisses became drier, hugs shorter. When I tried to start a conversation, it felt like I was talking to a wall, And no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the feeling of being alone in a relationship was growing inside me. It was as if there was something in our home that couldn't be touched, but I felt it. I searched for any excuse I could give for what was happening. Who hasn't clung to hope, right? I thought it was just a phase. He was tired, I was tired, the routine was weighing me down. But deep down, my heart knew something deeper was happening, something I didn't want to face. I tried my best to maintain my faith, as I always had. As a Christian, I believed that if I prayed enough, if I asked with all my heart, things would return to normal. I trusted that God was in control and that He would resolve things, as He always had. But over time, things began to feel more complicated. Conversations became fewer and fewer, His answers shorter, and when I tried to talk about what was bothering me, He simply withdrew even further. He became increasingly distant and increasingly cold. I looked at him, trying to understand. What happened to our connection? Where is the man I married? But he didn't answer. Not really. The silence was deafening, more so than any spoken word. I knew the pain was there, but I didn't know how deep it ran. As I began to see the first signs of what lay behind this estrangement, the truth began to reveal itself in ways I never imagined. And it was at that moment, deep in my prayer, searching for a miracle, that I discovered the hidden truth, something I couldn't even dream of, something that made me question everything I believed about love, trust, and fidelity. The first time I found out he was cheating, my world fell apart. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling into an endless abyss. You know that feeling of disorientation, where everything around you seems to be spinning, and you can't seem to hold on to anything? That's exactly what it was. I saw the messages, found the signs I'd previously tried to ignore, until the truth, cruel and painful, came to light in a way I could no longer hide from myself. I had my suspicions, but I always believed I was just exaggerating, that I was being overly sensitive. After all, who hasn't doubted a little something they didn't want to see? But with each message, each hint, each blank look he gave me, I was led deeper and deeper into the reality that the lie was much more present than I imagined. The feeling of deception grew until everything became clear before my eyes. And then, I could no longer escape the truth I never wanted to accept. He was cheating on me. I didn't know how to react, how to deal with it. My heart felt like it was in pieces, my body frozen, incapable of movement. How could the man with whom I'd shared my life, my dreams, my prayers, be capable of doing this to me? I felt crushed. The pain of seeing my trust shattered was greater than any other pain I'd ever felt before. Everything I believed in, everything I'd built, was being destroyed right there in front of me, and I didn't know how to stop it. When the truth came out, words seemed at a loss. There was nothing to say, no more explanations that could make sense. Only devastation remained. The pain of betrayal wasn't just in the act itself, but in the profound emotional impact it had on me. How could someone I loved, someone I thought I knew, do something so destructive? The disappointment was even more painful than the betrayal itself, because deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something I couldn't even imagine. And in that moment, I found myself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. Shame, sadness, and despair all blended into one feeling. I wondered what I did wrong, what I failed at, where I went wrong. I knew I needed to make a decision, but I didn't know where to begin. My mind was so confused and the pain so intense, I could barely process what was happening. And so, with the weight of the truth crushing down on me, I found myself in a place where the only thing left was to search for an answer. How could something so shattered be rebuilt? What could one do when the lie had become a reality impossible to ignore? I looked at him and no longer knew who was there. The man I married, the one I imagined spending my life with, the man I loved deeply, seemed to have disappeared. I looked into his eyes, but I no longer saw the man who, one day, promised to be by my side in good times and bad, in sickness and in health. And that, in itself, was an immeasurable pain. The betrayal wasn't just about my body, but about the trust I had placed in him, about everything we had built together, about the dreams I thought we were capable of achieving together. He hadn't just broken the alliance. He had destroyed the foundation on which our story was built. And deep down, I wondered, how could I rebuild this? But amidst all this pain and anger, another conflict was brewing within me. I felt lost, completely confused. As a Christian, my faith told me that forgiveness was the right path. I knew that forgiveness wasn't just an option, but a duty I had to fulfill, not for him, but for myself, for my own peace. But how could I forgive something so painful, something that seemed so irreparable? How could I simply forget what happened and move on? How could I forgive someone who not only betrayed me, but also undermined the trust I had spent years building? The pain of seeing myself betrayed was so great that at times I wondered if forgiveness was truly possible. I felt torn between anger and the desire for peace, between the need for justice and the call to forgive. Every thought was like an internal battle, and I didn't know which path to follow. What confused me most was the feeling that, by forgiving him, I would be validating what he did, that I would be allowing him to continue hurting me. But on the other hand, I knew that forgiveness was the key to freedom. The freedom not to go back, not to stay in the marriage, but to find peace within myself. And while I was in this whirlwind of emotions, the question of what to do with my faith also haunted me. I knew God was watching me, and on the one hand, I wanted so much to trust him, but on the other, taking that step seemed impossible. How could I be strong enough to forgive something so great? How could I accept God's forgiveness when I couldn't even forgive myself for feeling betrayed? And in that moment of total uncertainty, my mind and heart were in complete conflict, and I knew that the decision I made would change everything. Because forgiveness or separation wouldn't just be decisions about the marriage, but about who I would be from then on. I needed to understand not only what he did, but its impact on me, on my journey of faith and transformation. I found myself in a terrible dilemma. How to move forward, how to decide between forgiving or following my own path. Forgiveness seemed like the path to healing, but I couldn't ignore what I was feeling. How could I accept that he, the man I loved, had betrayed me so cruelly? No matter how much I tried to be rational, no matter how much I wanted to believe that forgiveness would be liberating, my mind was completely out of control, and my heart, broken, only wanted to know why he had done this to me. I knew that the decision I made wouldn't change the past, but it would define my future. And the hardest part was that I didn't know what future I truly wanted for myself. Did I want to fight for him, for the marriage, for our family, or should I simply turn the page and go it alone, rebuilding everything from scratch? The pain of choice became increasingly difficult to bear. Amidst all this confusion, I still tried to find meaning in the words I'd preached so often to others. Faith seemed to be calling me to take the next step, but how could I trust something that seemed to have failed me? How could I accept God's forgiveness when I couldn't even forgive myself for being so vulnerable, for trusting too much? The journey of faith, no matter how much it called to me, seemed like a never-ending road, but there was something inside me, a flame of hope that still burned, telling me that if I found the courage to continue, I could emerge stronger. And that's when, in the midst of my despair, I realized that this moment could become my transformation, if I had the courage to face the pain and move forward. If this topic resonated with you, if you've also found yourself in this place of pain and indecision, leave a comment below with what touched you most about this story. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with stories and experiences like mine. Sharing, commenting, and subscribing here is how we connect on a journey of transformation and healing. I know that, like me, you have much to share and can help other women find their strength. And with that, we can together grow and find paths to overcoming. I personally found comfort and clarity in taking that first step. The truth is, regardless of what happens with my marriage, this journey has transformed me. It has made me realize how much faith is a foundation, but also how necessary it is to learn to trust yourself. And as difficult as it was, I knew there was something deeper being revealed in this pain, something I needed to understand to move forward. And now, the question that remains in my heart is, what does faith really mean in the midst of pain and abandonment? How can we truly experience the transformation God has for us, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart? What I didn't know was that his betrayal was going much deeper than I imagined. I thought the messages and signs I'd already encountered were the worst that could happen, but the truth was much deeper and more painful than I could have anticipated. I was trying to recover, trying to understand how this all happened and how I could forgive him, but instead, the truth emerged in a more brutal way. He'd gotten his lover pregnant. When I received this news, something inside me crumbled. I felt as if I were being ripped from my body, as if everything I believed and knew had turned to ash before me. What frightened me most was not just the fact that he had gotten another woman pregnant, but the impact it had had on my very identity. How could he do this to me? How could he destroy everything we had, the life we had planned, the faith we shared? The pain of betrayal multiplied, and I felt as if I were being punished, without understanding why. The feeling was one of profound abandonment, not just emotional, but almost spiritual. I looked at him and the situation, trying to understand the extent of what had happened, and I couldn't. The news took me by surprise in a way I never imagined. I had prepared myself for betrayal, but not for something so profound and devastating. I never imagined he would go so far. And with every word he said to me to try to justify the situation, I felt myself being buried deeper in pain. Each explanation sounded hollow and distant, as if he were a completely different person from the one I loved. How could he act this way? How could someone who promised to be by my side through thick and thin make such a devastating decision? I know many might think, but as a Christian, you knew you needed to forgive. And believe me, I did. I knew my faith told me to forgive and move on. But at that moment, my heart was so crushed that I couldn't find the strength to make that decision. How do you move on when the truth you discover is such a profound lie? How do you rebuild something when the foundation has been completely destroyed in ways you never imagined? I found myself lost, unsure of what to do, unsure of which direction to take. What I feared most was not just the end of my marriage, but what would happen to me. Who was I now? I was being forced to face a reality that seemed impossible to accept, and yet it was the only truth I could see before me. The pain of betrayal became a weight impossible to carry alone. I knew I needed help, but I was so immersed in my grief that I didn't know where to find the strength to make the right decision. All I could think was, how could he do this? How could he destroy our story in such a cold, calculating way? I wanted to understand the reason, the logic behind it all, but instead, I only found more questions and more pain. That was the moment I realized my journey wasn't just about marriage, but about who I was becoming. I was being challenged to find my strength in ways I never imagined, and at the same time, I found myself questioning everything I believed to be right. I knew this moment would forever mark my life, and while I didn't know what the future held, I also knew that this revealed truth had the power to transform me in ways I could never have imagined. I just didn't know how it would happen, or what impact it would have on my own heart and faith. How do I move forward when the pain seems greater than any promise of healing? How do I find peace in the midst of it all? I was broken, desperate. Everything seemed to be crumbling around me as if life, which had once made so much sense, was now completely lost. The pain was so intense that for a moment I thought I couldn't bear it. I felt like I was in pieces, unsure how to deal with the devastation that had taken hold within me. It was as if I were living a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The man I loved had betrayed me so cruelly, and the truth he revealed to me, more than any words, destroyed what was left of me. I needed relief, an escape, a reason to believe again. And it was in that moment of utter despair that I went to my room, alone, and cried out to God. I asked him for a miracle, a sign that this wouldn't be the end. I didn't know if my marriage could be saved, if it had any chance of healing, but I knew I didn't want to go on like this. I didn't want to live with this pain, with this emptiness that consumed me. My prayer was simple, but filled with desperate pleading. I wasn't asking for more time. I wasn't asking for more empty words. I was asking for healing, for restitution, for something that would make me feel alive again. I wanted, with all my heart, to feel that the promises he made to me would be fulfilled, that the pain I carried would not be in vain. I believed he would hear. I believe to this day that he hears all prayers, especially the most sincere and painful ones. But what I didn't expect, and what truly shocked me, was that nothing happened. The answer I so desperately hoped for, so desperately desired, seemed far, far away. I stood there, alone, in the silence of my room, waiting for an answer that never came. God's silence was as powerful as the pain I was feeling, and it was in this silence that I began to question my faith even more. Why hadn't He answered? Had He not heard me? Or was it that, somehow, I didn't deserve this answer? That feeling of being ignored, of crying out and not being heard, was devastating. That moment made me realize that, often, the answer we expect doesn't come in the way we imagine. Sometimes, silence is an answer too. And it was in that silence that I began to realize something profound. Perhaps God was calling me to look within myself, to seek a strength I hadn't yet discovered. Perhaps He was showing me that, before any external miracle, I needed to be restored within. The miracle wasn't just about what He could do in my marriage, but about what He wanted to do in my life, in my mind, in my heart. And perhaps I had to go through this pain to learn to trust in something greater than myself. It was difficult, very difficult, to deal with the lack of an immediate response. But little by little, I began to understand that even in the pain and silence, I was still being guided by something greater. I knew that this moment would not be the end, but rather the beginning of a journey that I didn't know where it would lead, but that I was willing to follow, even though I was afraid, even though I didn't understand. I was lost and felt like the whole world was watching me, silently judging me. I was already in a very dark place, but what hurt me most was the lack of support. I desperately sought solace in the church, in the people I believed would understand me, who would help me carry this weight. I asked for prayers. I asked for intercession for me, for help finding a way. What I received, however, was deafening silence, an absence that only increased my feeling of abandonment. It seemed no one knew what to do with my pain. How could I deal with a Christian woman who was facing her husband's betrayal? How could I deal with someone who, despite her faith and trust, found herself shattered by something so cruel and irreversible? I was confronted not only with the pain of betrayal, but with the church's inability to deal with something so human, so devastating. The humility and understanding I expected were lacking, and instead, I found myself ignored, almost invisible. How could I, a devout Christian, be so judged and silenced at a time when I most needed support? Why did no one know how to address my pain? I understand that betrayal is a complex topic, that many people, including those within the church, don't know how to offer the kind of support that truly heals. But the silence, the lack of comforting words, the absence of a helping hand, was what made me question myself the most. Those people, with whom I'd shared so many blessings and prayers, seemed uncomfortable, unable to deal with my reality. It was as if what I was going through was taboo, a subject to be avoided. I didn't want to be told I should forgive immediately, or that everything would work out with more prayer. What I needed, in that moment, was compassion. What I truly sought was to be heard, to be understood, and not dismissed for being broken. It was painful to realize that, in my fragility, I hadn't found the open arms I'd imagined I would. It wasn't the words of the Bible that I needed to hear at that moment. I didn't need cliches or advice that would minimize what I was feeling. I just wanted someone to look at me and say, "I understand. You're not alone." But that didn't happen. I was alone, with my pain and the silence of those who could have helped me. This lack of support made me feel even more helpless. I began to question my true place in my faith, my place within the church. Would I, in my moment of pain, no longer be seen as a woman, but as a symbol of shame, as a woman who no longer fit the standards of Christian morality? How could I continue to believe in a system that, instead of empowering me, left me adrift, without support, without a shoulder to cry on? The impact of not being heard was more painful than any bitter words my husband could have said. It was then that I realized that, as much as I sought strength from others to move forward, I would need to find that strength within myself. The journey toward healing wouldn't be accompanied by the support I'd hoped for, but by the internal transformation I'd have to pursue alone. But the question remained, how do you find strength when you feel left behind, both by those you loved most and by the very faith that once sustained you. And it was in that moment of silence, of solitude, that a much deeper revelation began to unfold within me. The truth I wasn't ready to hear, but which became essential to my growth, began to emerge. Because sometimes, the silence of those around us doesn't mean we're helpless, but rather, that true support comes from within, and only then do we realize how much stronger we are than we imagined. I was surrounded by people, but I felt completely alone. Deep down, the pain consuming me felt so unique, so mine, that I couldn't see how anyone could truly understand what I was going through. I was surrounded, yes, but every smile, every sympathetic look I received felt empty. It was as if loneliness were an invisible shadow, ever present, always following me, even when there were people around. What hurt me most wasn't the pain itself, but the feeling that no one truly saw me. I was there, visible to everyone, yet somehow invisible to those who mattered most. The weight of judgment from society, the church, and my own family was like a heavy cloak I carried every day. I knew the words I spoke, the things I shared, were being analyzed and often distorted. As someone who has experienced betrayal, you know how easy it is to become the target of judgmental looks, criticism disguised as advice, and the perception that you were somehow responsible for it all. Every conversation, every encounter, seemed to carry immense weight. I was no longer at the center of conversations. I was no longer seen as the woman of faith, the exemplary wife. I was seen as the woman who failed, the woman who couldn't hold her marriage together, the woman who was now the victim of a tragedy, but no one knew how to handle it. I felt that society, and even the church, which should have been a haven of support, saw me as a failure, as someone who had lost their way in their own mistakes and choices. When someone goes through such great pain, the last thing we need is judgment. We need understanding, someone willing to see beyond the pain, someone who can help us look within and find the strength to move forward. But instead, I felt like I was being observed almost coldly, as if my pain were a reflection of my inability to be good enough. And the worst part was, I couldn't find a way to fit into this new space that seemed to have been imposed on me. The pain was more than I could bear. Each morning was a reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. I wondered if there really was a place for someone like me, someone who had failed, someone who found themselves adrift, with a broken marriage and a crumbling faith. Where was the place for women like me? Where were the welcoming arms that would make me feel that, despite everything, I still had value? Where were the words that would make me believe that, in the end, there would be purpose to my pain? I no longer knew where to turn. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing by seeking support from those who, until then, had been my pillars, or if I was simply drifting further and further away from what had once sustained me. The silence, the pitying looks, the lack of words of comfort, all of this made the loneliness even stronger. I didn't know if it was due to hidden prejudice or simply because they didn't know what to say in the face of such profound pain. The truth is, at many moments, I just wanted to feel that I wasn't alone in the midst of that chaos. However, as the days passed and the pain didn't lessen, I began to realize that perhaps the real journey wasn't about finding a place where I fit in, but about finding the strength within myself to live through it all. How could I start over? How could I rebuild myself if no one seemed to give me the space to do so? Perhaps the answer lay precisely in moving forward, in continuing, even without understanding, even without having all the answers. And it was this questioning, this relentless search for a solution, that led me to reflect on something even deeper. How could I, myself, change my mindset and take the first step toward regaining my strength and faith, even when the world around me seemed to be pushing me to the bottom? This led me to realize that, although the path was lonely, perhaps it was precisely in this solitude that I would find the key to my transformation. The pain of loneliness made me realize that we often seek support from the wrong people or in the wrong place, not out of malice, but because no one can truly feel what we feel. Words, however well-intentioned, are often not enough to heal the emptiness we feel within. I needed something deeper. I knew the healing journey was mine, and no one else could do it for me. But at the same time, something inside me still yearned for connection, for validation, for knowing I was not alone. And it was at that moment that I realized the power our own journey can have on others. Sometimes, what we need most is to know that our pain is understood by someone. If this story resonates with you, if you somehow feel connected to this story of transformation and overcoming, I'd like to ask you to like this video. By liking, you're not only helping the channel grow, but also ensuring that more people can be reached by this kind of message. I know how important it is to feel that there's a community of support, a network of women who are going through or have gone through something similar. And when you give your support, you're helping to spread this healing network. You may not know it, but a simple like can help make more people feel welcomed and understood, just as I wish I could feel at many points in this journey. Now, returning to my own journey, it was with solitude as my companion that I began to learn something very powerful. I wasn't truly alone. In fact, it was in the silence of the voices around me that I could hear my own voice, the voice that spoke the truth I most needed to hear, that my strength didn't come from others, but from within myself. This isn't to say that others aren't important. Of course they are. But the transformation I sought wouldn't come from the outside in. It would need to come from the inside out. And this discovery was one of the most profound I could make amidst so much pain. As the pain persisted, I realized I was being shaped by it, that it was transforming me, teaching me not to depend on anything or anyone to be who I needed to be. I was learning to empower myself, to find my own answers, to walk with more confidence in the decisions I made. And above all, I was learning to trust that, even in the most difficult situations, life can take us places we never imagined, but that, in the end, make us more whole, stronger, more complete. Now, as I moved away from the pain and began to see my inner strength more clearly, I began to realize an even more powerful truth, that self-love and acceptance of who I was, regardless of the flaws or pain I carried, would be the key to everything. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was losing my identity, my purpose, my vision for the future. When you build your life around someone, when you dedicate your energy, your dreams, and your expectations to one person and what you together envision as your future, the impact of a loss like this goes far beyond what you can immediately perceive. I no longer knew who I was without my husband, without the idealized life we had planned together. What was left of me if everything I knew seemed to be disintegrating before my eyes? I was broken, directionless, unsure of how to rebuild myself. Each day felt like a new challenge, a new obstacle to overcome. I was so accustomed to my role as wife, as partner, that I didn't know who I was without it. Everything I had learned, all my knowledge of what it meant to be in a relationship, of what it meant to be loved and important, all of it seemed to have vanished. I no longer knew what it meant to have a purpose. The pain wasn't just the end of the marriage, but the feeling that I had lost myself somewhere along this journey. How could I find my way back when the path itself had been erased? I looked at myself and didn't recognize myself. The woman who was once full of dreams, who had her whole life ahead of her and believed that everything she wanted was within her reach, seemed to have disappeared. I looked in the mirror and no longer knew who was there. The promises of eternal love, the expectations I had about my life with him, all of it had turned to dust. I was no longer living according to my own dreams, but desperately trying to cope with the weight of a reality I hadn't planned, didn't want, and that was crushing me. That feeling of being lost was devastating. I hadn't just lost my marriage, but in my mind, I had lost my reason for living. What was left for me? Who was I now? I began to wonder if I could ever be happy again, if there was anything good in store for me in the future. How could someone who saw themselves as part of a couple, as part of an us, now look in the mirror and understand that that us no longer existed? I was alone, and the pain of losing my marriage was just a reflection of the even greater pain of losing the idea of who I was within it. Every thought about the future was clouded by fear and insecurity. How do you rebuild your life when the foundation on which everything was built is gone? How do you find the motivation to move forward again when everything you knew and believed you had built has been destroyed? I knew the pain of loss was shaping me in some way, but I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I knew there was something beyond that pain, something waiting for me, but the road seemed dark, with no signs of direction. The anguish of not knowing who I was without him was a suffocating sensation. I began to question my own choices. Had I defined myself too much through him, through our relationship? How could I have lost my identity so radically? Each day was a new test, a new attempt to find a path that would make me feel alive again. But no matter how hard I tried, I found myself constantly returning to the same point, the pain of knowing that the person I loved had betrayed me and that everything I'd imagined for the future had gone down the drain. It was then that I began to realize that the loss wasn't just about him, not just about what he did to me, but about what I had stopped being in the process. I found myself erasing my own history and becoming something I had never imagined myself to be. Someone without a clear definition, someone without a defined place in the world. I was beginning to understand that, to move forward, I would need to find a new way of seeing myself, understanding myself, and most importantly, accepting myself. Because, in losing what I believed to be my identity, I had, in fact, lost connection with the true essence of who I was. I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. I would have to rebuild not only my marriage, but my own story, my very being. The pain of loss, though immense, would also become the catalyst for a transformation I couldn't have anticipated. Something inside me began to shift. I didn't know exactly what this new me would be, but I realized that if I wanted to find purpose again, I would need to embrace the pain, grieve, and at the same time allow myself to change, grow, and discover a version of myself that was stronger, more whole, and more connected to the woman I truly was, regardless of what had happened in the past. This wouldn't be a simple process. I still felt the pain, still wondered about all I'd lost, but with each step, I realized that true transformation would only happen when I allowed myself to step out of the shadows of sadness and embrace the future that awaited me with courage and hope. I began to question my faith in a way I never imagined possible. How could a good and loving God allow something so devastating to happen to me? How could he allow me to go through so much pain, so much humiliation and loneliness, when I had always sought him, always tried to live according to his teachings? The pain made me deeply doubt, and for the first time, I felt as if my faith were fragile, as if everything I believed in wasn't enough to keep me going. I prayed every day, heartbroken, but the answers didn't come. I spoke to God, but I felt he was silent, as if my words were falling into a void. That feeling of abandonment was even more painful than anything else. I wanted to believe he was with me, that he would hear my prayers and bring some form of relief, but each day I found myself further away from him, further removed from the faith that had once sustained me. I no longer knew how to deal with the silence. The pain I was feeling seemed greater than any explanation I could receive. Why hadn't he answered? Did he really care about me? It wasn't just a crisis of faith. It was a profound questioning of God's very existence. How could I trust something or someone who seemed invisible, untouchable, when I needed answers most? How could I, a woman who had always believed in his promises, accept silence in the midst of such intense pain? And then the doubt grew. I found myself wondering if I was being ignored, if my pain was insignificant to God, or if I had done something so terrible that he simply didn't want to hear me. Prayers, which had once been a natural occurrence, began to feel like a burden. I prayed because I knew it was expected of me, but I no longer felt the connection, the peace I once found in prayer. I began to doubt if he was still there, if he truly cared, or if, somehow, I was alone. It was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. My faith, which had once sustained me, now felt fragile and full of holes, like an old blanket that no longer warmed me. But as I went through this process of grief and questioning, something began to shift within me. Perhaps God's answer wasn't an audible voice. Perhaps the silence I felt wasn't absence, but a different way of connecting with him. I was so focused on my pain, my anguish, that I couldn't see that God's answer could be different, that he was somehow showing me strength I didn't know I had. Perhaps he was guiding me, not through words, but through the experience of pain, grief, and transformation. The truth was that in that moment, I needed to face my pain, feel the magnitude of my loss, and at the same time, learn to trust again. I didn't know how this would happen or where to begin. All I felt was an immense emptiness, and yet I kept praying, even though I didn't understand why, even though I felt nothing. Because deep down, I knew that faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about trusting even in the midst of uncertainty, about believing that, even though I didn't understand what was happening, God still had a greater plan for me. I was in a dark place, but I wasn't alone, even though it felt like it. Over time, I began to realize that the lack of quick answers didn't mean He wasn't listening, but that He was teaching me something deeper, something I couldn't learn without experiencing this pain. God didn't promise me a life without suffering, but He promised to be with me in the midst of it, even when everything seemed meaningless. God's silence wasn't a denial of His love, but an opportunity for me to learn to trust Him more deeply. What was happening to me wasn't the end of my faith, but rather a new phase of it, where I would have to find strength and confidence where before there had been only doubt and hopelessness. I was being led into a transformation that, though painful, had the potential to strengthen me, to teach me to trust in a way I had never done before. It was then that I realized that even in pain, I couldn't turn away from God. I couldn't allow the weight of my grief to pull me away from the only source of true strength I had. I felt as if the earth were being ripped from under my feet, and that by turning away from God, I would lose the only anchor that still gave me some sense of stability. The pain was immense. God's silence suffocated me. But deep down, I knew He would never abandon me, even when He seemed distant. The truth is, in that situation, the only thing I had left was faith, a faith that, perhaps, was more fragile, but it was still mine, and I needed to nourish it. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but something inside me insisted that I not give up on my search for Him. I needed to rediscover my faith, not because everything was right, or because my prayers were being answered the way I imagined, but because He never abandoned me, even when I thought He was silent. I knew that God wasn't a distant being who simply ignored me in difficult times. He was there, even when I couldn't feel Him. He was with me every step of the way, even when the pain blinded me to it. I needed to give Him space to work in my heart, even when the only thing I wanted was to understand why everything was happening. I decided I wouldn't let this pain separate me from my faith. It wouldn't be easy, and I often felt lost, like I was in a stormy sea where I couldn't see dry land. But I made the decision to move forward, to keep searching. I knew this journey would be a process. It wouldn't be an overnight solution. Transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but I knew I had to start somewhere. I had to open my heart again, allow God to speak to me, even if it wasn't in the way I expected. It's curious how pain has the power to transform us, even when we don't want it to. I went through many phases, feeling anger, confusion, anguish, but also moments of deep reflection. I began to understand that pain wasn't a punishment, but part of the journey I needed to go through to reach something greater. I wasn't alone, even when I felt like I was. Perhaps what I was going through wasn't about being immediately saved from pain, but about learning something new about myself, about my faith, and about my ability to endure and continue to trust, even in silence. God wasn't ignoring me. He was leading me to a place where I would need to learn to trust Him, even without seeing the answers I wanted. The new beginning didn't come with grand revelations or sudden miracles, but with a gradual shift within me. Every prayer, even the quietest ones, began to make sense. With each passing day, I felt my connection with God grow again, albeit in a different way than I was used to. It was no longer about seeking quick answers or easy solutions, but about learning to walk in the dark with confidence, knowing that, even though I couldn't see the path ahead clearly, He was there, guiding my every step. I began to realize that faith isn't something you have only when everything is going well. True faith is the kind that stays alive even in the most difficult moments, when answers don't come and the pain seems unbearable. That's when I accepted that faith also involves trusting in what we don't see, and more importantly, trusting that God has a greater purpose, even when we can't understand it at the time. True strength came from understanding that He was with me through every part of my pain, not leaving me alone, teaching me that the loss, the silence, and the waiting were part of something much greater, something I would only understand later. It was during this process of starting over that I began to realize that my healing journey wouldn't just be about restoring my marriage, but about restoring myself, my identity, and my faith. I wasn't just trying to return to my former self, but creating a new version of myself, stronger, more aware of my dependence on God, more connected to my own inner strength. I was being shaped by everything I experienced, and although it was painful, I knew that in the end, this transformation would be something beautiful, even if not immediately visible. I was no longer alone, neither in my prayers nor in my struggles. God was with me, even in the silence, and this was the beginning of my new path. And as I looked at all of this, I understood that my faith needed to be more than an escape from pain. It needed to be the key to the transformation I was seeking, the only true source of hope and strength for the next steps on this journey. I was no longer just waiting for answers, but learning to trust the process, to trust that, even without understanding, life would continue to teach me what I needed to learn to move forward. I learned, in the most painful way possible, that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It wasn't about what they had or hadn't done. Forgiveness was, in fact, about myself. And in realizing this, something inside me began to shift. I didn't know exactly how or when it would happen, but I understood that if I wanted to find peace, I needed to free my heart from the anger, hurt, and pain that consumed me. Forgiveness wasn't something I did for him, but for myself, so I could move on and free myself from the weight I carried. It wasn't easy. I didn't wake up overnight and simply decide to forgive. The pain was so deep that forgiveness often seemed impossible. How could I forgive something that had destroyed me inside? How could I simply let go of everything I'd been through, all the nights of tears, all the moments of loneliness, and the lies I'd been told? But over time, I realized that anger and resentment weren't helping me. On the contrary, they were imprisoning me. I was holding myself captive to the pain I couldn't let go of. It was at that moment, when I felt at my weakest, that I realized the strength that forgiveness brought. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't easy, but little by little, something began to happen. With each prayer, with each reflection, I began to release the weight. Forgiveness didn't mean what happened was right, or that I didn't have the right to feel pain. But it did mean I was ready to relinquish control of my life without being dominated by what he did. It was a painful but necessary process. Little by little, God gave me the strength to move forward, to look to the future without the weight of the memories that consumed me. I began to realize that true healing didn't come from going back and fixing what had been done, but from looking to the future with hope, with faith that I could be more than what had happened to me. Forgiveness was key to transformation. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about accepting the pain and deciding not to let it rule my life. I was ready to take the next step, even though I didn't know exactly what the future would hold. I knew that by forgiving, I wasn't validating what had been done, but rather opening a path to my own healing, to reconnecting with myself and the purpose that still awaited me. The process of forgiveness wasn't linear. There were days when I felt I was doing well, and others when the pain returned with a vengeance. But over time, I realized that this healing process wasn't something I could control. It was guided by God, and I needed to trust his timing. Each small victory was proof that I was rebuilding myself, that I was still capable of loving myself and others, despite the pain I had faced. Trusting in God gave me strength, even when I couldn't see the entire path ahead. He showed me, day after day, that there was something greater in my life, something I would only understand later, but which I could already feel in my heart. I was still at the beginning of my healing journey. Forgiveness didn't mean the process of overcoming pain was over, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. I was learning to look in the mirror and see a stronger, wiser woman, more capable of handling the challenges life threw at me. Forgiveness was my liberation, and with it, pain no longer had the power to paralyze me. Little by little, I began to believe that there was something beautiful ahead of me, something I couldn't yet clearly see, but that was guiding me. Now, looking back, I understand that forgiveness was the key to my transformation. It freed me from the prison of anger and sadness and allowed me to look to the future with new eyes. I learned that even in the most difficult circumstances, God has a greater purpose. Sometimes He leads us down paths we don't understand, but which shape us, preparing us for something greater. What I experienced brought me to a place of self-knowledge, and through forgiveness, I began to connect with the woman I always was, but who had lost her way. I was still rebuilding myself, but now I knew that rebuilding was possible, that pain wasn't the end, but the beginning of something new. I was ready to move on, with renewed faith, a lighter heart, and the certainty that, even in the midst of pain, God never abandoned me. I no longer wanted to hide. I no longer wanted to live in shame of my story, afraid that others would see me as weak or inferior. For a long time, the pain was something I tried to carry alone, thinking that by keeping it hidden, I could avoid others' judgment. But as time passed, I realized that this attempt to hide my pain only made it heavier. I felt increasingly isolated, as if the pain was separating me from others, and at the same time, disconnecting me from who I truly was. It was then that I realized that the true path to healing wasn't hiding what I was experiencing, but sharing it. When I started talking about what I was going through, sharing my pain with other women, something shifted. I began to see that I wasn't alone, that other women were also facing their own battles, their own losses and frustrations. By sharing my pain, I discovered that pain, though difficult and challenging, could also be a bridge, not a prison. Connecting with others, especially other women, helped me realize that my pain didn't define me. It wasn't the end of my story, but a part of it. And by talking about it, I began to free myself from the chains of fear and shame that had kept me paralyzed. I saw how transformative pain can be when shared, because when you share your experiences with those who truly understand you, it loses its power to consume you. I was understood, welcomed, and most importantly, I felt seen. The women I spoke with, who also had their own stories of overcoming, showed me that pain can be a bond between people. It can teach us to be more empathetic, stronger, and more courageous. By finding the courage to open my heart and tell my story, I began to understand how important it is to find support and strength in community, especially in moments of weakness. At first, I hesitated, believing that if I shared my pain, I would somehow be exposing myself too much. I thought people might judge me or think I was seeking attention or compassion. But instead, what I found was genuine acceptance, a support network that showed me I was not alone, neither in my pain nor in my quest for healing. Sharing my pain was the first step in discovering that it didn't have to be a lonely burden. It could be a bridge to something greater, to a deeper understanding of myself and the life I could still build. The shame I felt was slowly replaced by the strength I found in other women who were willing to listen and share their own experiences. I began to understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, but strength. By opening up, I wasn't becoming weak, but stronger, more human. Showing that I was dealing with pain, that I was in the process of healing, made me feel more connected to the world around me. And most importantly, it made me realize that this pain wasn't a sentence, but a step in my journey of self-discovery and transformation. True healing began when I accepted that my story, with all its pain and loss, also had value. It wasn't something I should be ashamed of, but something that could help others. I began to see that by sharing my pain, I was not only releasing the weight I carried, but also inspiring other women to do the same. Pain, when shared with empathy, becomes a source of collective strength, and that's what allows us, together, to overcome adversity. And realizing this, my perspective on pain shifted. It stopped being something that imprisoned me and became a fundamental part of my journey of healing and growth. I understood that by living my story without shame, by sharing my pain, I was not only freeing myself, but also creating space for other women to feel safe doing the same. Because ultimately, our pain connects us. It reminds us that we all go through difficult times, but also that we can support each other in the quest to overcome them. Pain can be a bridge, not a prison, if we share it with others and use it as a path to transformation. I began to understand that when pain is shared, it loses its power to destroy us and becomes a fundamental step in rebuilding what seemed lost. No matter how deep or difficult the pain, it doesn't have to be experienced in solitude. By making room for vulnerability, I created a new mindset about my journey, a journey no longer defined by pain, but by the courage to face it head-on and transform it into something greater. This transformation doesn't happen immediately, but it begins to take shape as you allow yourself to live your truth, share your struggles, and ultimately look to the future with a new perspective. If you identified with my story, if you've also been through something similar, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your experience. We women need each other so much, especially when we feel alone. Mutual support and the sharing of experiences help us realize that we're not alone on this journey, that our pain, however intense, can transform into something stronger and more positive when shared. Pain, when shared, becomes lighter. And when we unite, we become capable of weathering any storm. I know how difficult it is to deal with loss, with betrayal, with the doubts that arise in such delicate moments. But by sharing, we can find the strength we sometimes don't find alone. It's incredible how, by talking and listening to each other, we can find meaning in the chaos. What seemed like the end can actually be the beginning of something more beautiful, deeper, stronger. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I invite you to do so now. Let's continue this journey together, following stories of faith, overcoming, and, above all, learning to transform pain into strength. I promise that, together, we can find the light at the end of the tunnel. You are not alone. We are all here, fighting, growing, and supporting each other. Sharing our stories is a way to generate transformation, not only in our own lives, but also in the lives of other women who, like you and me, are searching for answers, healing, and hope. Let's continue this journey together, because every step, every story shared, is another step toward our own freedom and growth.